You're listening to HR Leader, inspiring you to lead the workforce of tomorrow.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of the HR Leader podcast. My name's Jerome Doraisamy. I'm coming to you today from Camaragal Land in Sydney, and I'm very pleased to be joined in the studio by May Samali, who is the founder and chief executive of Human Leadership Lab. She joins me here in the studio. May, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, Jerome.
Today we are going to be discussing the future of work, how leadership expectations are shifting as a result, and what this all means for HR professionals like yourselves. May, there's a lot to get into here, but before we do, tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do.
Thanks so much for the question. So the way that I got into the work around leadership development was not actually through the more traditional HR lens. I started my career in very high performance type environments, corporate lawyer. I then went and worked in venture capital in Silicon Valley. There was a lot that happened in between, but the common thread is I was in environments sort of fast paced, high outcome driven, and really relentless in many ways, and learned very quickly the importance of execution, being able to work hard, work fast. At the same time, I started to notice the founders around me or the leaders that I was working with, that things were crumbling at the edges. I noticed in venture capital as an investor that we had founders that we were working for who had incredible business models, incredible execution, but were crumbling under emotional or mental pressure. I had the pleasure of working for a couple of different companies while I was in the US, had some amazing genius leaders I was working with, and yet noticed, despite their strategic brilliance, they couldn't retain staff, weren't able to have difficult conversations, weren't able to think about the needs of their evolving staff. And that led me to this question of, well, what does it take to actually build high-performance teams? But what does it mean about our inner leadership? What does it mean about the human capabilities we need to build to be able to not just execute strategically, technically with excellence, but be able to bring people along with us? And it's that curiosity that led me to actually found the Human Leadership Lab a few years later.
Yeah. So that time at the coalface in corporate law firms, in venture capital firms, you really opened your eyes to some of these red flags, so to speak, that are impacting big business.
Definitely. And so, look, I think part and parcel is of this is the fact that it's systemic. Leadership used to be something that was more directive, autocratic. In terms of the Industrial Revolution, we needed productivity. The expectations of workers has evolved. And so I think some of those management techniques or leadership doctrines no longer resonated. And what you see is the human attrition side of it. And so that's why human leadership, the word human is really important. That's why it ends up in the company title, is that when we take the humanity sometimes out of the way that our workplaces operate, that's the biggest red flag. And it's not often the intention of leadership, it's the impact of the way of working.
So what's your sense when you look across the market and across sectors, what's your sense of leaders' cognizance and awareness of the need to adapt and pivot the ways in which they're leading teams and businesses? Are leaders, generally speaking, taking steps towards this, or is everyone sort of stuck in the old ways?
Great question. I think you see leadership responses across the spectrum. So we have a cohort of leaders, and these are the ones that perhaps I have less to do with because philosophically, I think the work that I do doesn't land as much here, is leaders who are looking for quick fixes. They know they need to get their teams to adapt and adjust to the changing world of work. And, how do we get our people to not be distracted by what's going on out there, the changes? How do we get them to commit? Even though there are probably more options out there than ever before, a lot of folks are creating multiple revenue streams, not just working for one employer. Portfolio careers, there's an ascendance and a rise of that, whether it's as a professional service provider, even HR. I have a lot of HR leaders I was working with as on the client side who are now off doing their own thing and working as a fractional HR lead across a number of organizations. So leaders who want quick fixes are perhaps the ones that don't want the old way of working to change and are looking for hacks to get their people to comply.
Yeah.
And then you've got a small percentage that are early adopters and are recognizing things are shifting. And a lot of those leaders are the ones that are thinking about, well, how do I actually internally as a leader myself start to build some of the capabilities around what I call the ABCs of human leadership: adaptability, bravery, and compassion. Now, how do I manage myself so that I can better manage my others? And what does that mean in terms of our leadership development training? What do we need to expose people to that's not just an inspiring keynote, but actually behavior change? How do we adapt our systems, our mindsets, our skills?
Yeah. You touched on something that I want to pick up on. You were talking about portfolio careers, and of course, in the current climate, we're seeing a lot more scattered workforces given the advent and mainstreaming of remote and flexible working arrangements. Do you think that for the individual workers on the ground, they are perceiving leaders differently now? Do they not have the same reverence, for lack of a better term, for their leaders as perhaps they once did? And is that changing the nature of leadership?
Yeah, it's a really interesting dynamic we see happening out there. I would say, in general, yes, there is a shift in expectations and conceptions of leadership. On the whole, I would say there's always been a little bit of backlash or lack of reverence or contrarian ways of working, but that's grown and become louder. And what that's I think a product of is, one, you've got a generation, whether it's Gen Z or millennials, who've grown up with tech and can actually share these ideas about what they don't want about work out there in a way that we have heard never before. But the second part of it is that actually we have a generation coming into the workforce who are values aligned in a different way to previous generations. The research shows that Gen Z and millennials are going to make up 74% of our workforce by 2030 globally. That's no joke, right? And yet this generation, Deloitte reports or Gallup reports in the last couple of years show that they're looking for more than just money. They're looking for meaning and they're looking for well-being. And so no longer are we looking for leadership as someone we look up to as a role model. We're looking for leadership in terms of behavior. If there's a disconnect between what we hear and what we see, there's more likelihood to go and want to do our own thing. And at the same time, we see that as a possibility. There are more and more examples of people who are building their own careers in a portfolio-oriented way, who have multiple revenue streams and are not constrained by one employer. So that's a really important part of the dynamic, in that I think there's now more accountability for organizations who are not willing to practice what they preach and walk the walk.
And what do you see as being the headline challenges in the current climate? As we record, the conflict in Iran remains ongoing, and there are, of course, economic and supply chain consequences arising from that. Hopefully that conflict is more seasonal than some of the longer term challenges. But from your perspective, what are the headline challenges impacting leadership approaches right now?
Great point around the macroeconomic and geopolitical tensions and challenges we see absolutely impact leadership. And I would say not only in the obvious ways like supply chain disruption, or if you got flights going through the Middle East, suddenly that's no longer possible. I'm actually going to Nepal in 2 weeks to hike Everest. And
awesome.
I've got a bunch of folks meant to join me coming across from the Middle East and Europe, and, flights are cancelled. So you've got the very practical implications like that. So at the same time as we have these macroeconomic and geopolitical challenges, there's a need internally within organizations to actually name and recognize these dynamics beyond the obvious impacts on the bottom line. And what that means in practice is compassion. So the C for compassion of leadership is a really important one. And this is around recognizing that what people are experiencing out there impacts the way they show up in here. And it's not that actually as leadership, we need to have all the answers or solve what's happening out there in here, but actually to recognize that, at the start of a meeting or at the start of our weekly stand-up, to recognize that people in the room might have been affected, to actually make sure that if our company is aligned or impacted, that we state that explicitly, that we open inquiry questions of leadership. How do we want to handle this situation? What's our response? I saw this a lot when I was working in the US about 6 years ago during the murder of George Floyd, and seeing how organizations were trying to either respond to or take a stance on how we felt about Black Lives Matters. This is no different to what we're seeing now, which is things are happening around the world that impact us as human beings. And our ability as leaders to bring that humanity, vulnerability, authenticity into the workplace, I think is what makes a big difference, particularly to Gen Z and millennial generations.
We're chatting with May Samali, and we'll be back with more right after this. May, you touched on something really interesting there regarding the authenticity and transparency piece. And it makes me think about how the lines are a lot more blurred between home and work in the current climate. And this has been really accelerated by the pandemic, of course. But, because we all have emails on our phones, tablets, home computers, and clients can contact you any hour of the day. Even if you've left the office, you may not necessarily have left the office. And this obviously means that leaders have to be more attuned to that, and they have to be more empathetic to their staff as well. Do you think it's overwhelming for leaders across sectors to have to take on those additional responsibilities, so to speak, of being of having to be more holistic in how they manage their staff?
Absolutely. And I would say without taking a holistic approach, it's probably not going to long-term succeed. What I mean by that is leaders who now need to think holistically about the impact of devices, tech, burnout on their folks are going to be well placed for building long-term sustainable high performance. And that's ultimately what we want in our workplaces. That ability to silo your employee into simply a productivity, an output mechanism was never going to long-term have sustainable results. And that is why we see so much burnout in certain sectors that still perhaps that take that approach. I think what's difficult when you use the word overwhelming, I think what's overwhelming for leadership is not so much that it's a burden to think about the people around us holistically, but that we haven't actually traditionally been equipped with the tools, frameworks, resources, and taught how to do it. We often haven't had it mirrored back to us or modeled to us, and therefore we're learning it from scratch. And that's why I talk a lot about the personal operating system, personal leadership operating system. Leadership starts from the inside out, which means in order to have effective team, relational leadership or organizational leadership, we actually need to start with self-leadership. And if as leaders we can do it for ourselves, it's a muscle we can grow, and then we can do it for others. It's much harder for me to think about the energy management of my team if I'm modeling burnout myself or not having boundaries and parameters. So it's actually a humbling experience, I think, for leadership. And that's why a lot of the work with the leadership development work I'm doing is actually starting with leaders. If you want to see your team be more X, Y, or Z, how are you going to be more X, Y, and Z?
You mentioned a couple of times taking a longer term approach, and at face value, I totally understand how and why that's important. But how do you look to reconcile the benefits of a longer term approach against some of the shorter term challenges that businesses will be facing? We were talking about some of the economic challenges and obviously geopolitical conflict. A lot of businesses are worried about onboarding AI and what does this mean for our day-to-day workflows. So there's all these sort of short-term or even urgent priorities that they have to grapple with. But how do you manage all of those whilst also taking a long-term approach?
I think it starts with being really clear as a company what your mission is and what your values are. Because short-termism often comes from trying to optimize for what we see as an output that's immediate, but often comes with short-term gain, long-term pain. And ultimately, it's the equivalent of I can eat a Big Mac right now, or I can delay that and exercise right now. And it's the same. They both have pain, but one's delayed and one's a bit more immediate. With organizations, the way that we can make those decisions rather than thinking about it as, oh God, I got to make decisions day to day on what to do. If we take a values-based approach, this is when values are less around sexy buzzwords on a poster on the wall, but more about operationalizing them into lived experiences and behavior. So some of the most effective organizations, and whether it's people, culture leaders that we're working with, or upper management, is how are you actually training your team to live the values through their behaviors, and are you actually embedding them into your performance management systems? So that actually allows us to then make decisions that are values aligned. Long term, that does help us hit our business metrics better, but also means that we can have higher employee engagement and retention over time. Because ultimately, even if we're optimizing for some of these short-term moments, it leads to issues with retention over time, or people want to go and move to places that are going to be developing them more. You've got organizations now who are telling their people, you know what? We recognize AI, particularly agentic AI, generative AI, is disrupting things. We don't want you to be scared. We're all a bit uncertain what's going to happen. Why don't we skill up internally? We're going to have the next week where you're not on your usual projects, but you're on tools.
Yeah.
We want you to go and build AI, bring it in. And so actually, that might be a short-term bad decision. That week has really low output from a ROI perspective, but long-term ROI on something like that is huge in organizations. And so they're the kinds of decisions we're needing to make.
Yeah, okay. And so once you've asked those questions of the business, how best can team leaders and in conjunction with HR then look to put in place the right practical steps?
Again, this is a really great one where we can see some model examples. I turn to some of the work of Brené Brown and Adam Grant, and they look at the best organizations are not those that have kind of the most well-framed values. They're the ones that have been able to transfer each of these values into operating principles that give anyone in the organization an indication of how I need to show up in what situation. And I was really inspired actually by the work coming out of Harvard. Siri Shalazi and Iris Benet. Siri was actually here in Sydney last year talking a lot about we don't make our workplaces fairer places to work, for example, through good intentions, through having a value like fairness.
Yeah.
You have it through actually embedding systems and behavior change from the bottom up. For example, if we want our teams to be more collaborative, that's a core value. Rather than saying we want everyone to contribute at meetings, you actually need to change the systems and structures of a meeting itself. Maybe at a weekly level, a rotating facilitator. Maybe people need to send their ideas in beforehand. Like maybe you have it in a way that allows those who are hybrid to communicate right at the start. Actual processes and systems, and then actually measuring these behaviors and these operating principles and circling them back into how we think about performance management and promotions. And that's that translation of taking something that we've fleshed out as an operating principle and then measuring promotion and success based on it. Only 11% of organizations do that. Those that do that have been shown to have the highest business performance too.
Okay. May I just have a few more questions, which we'll get to on the other side of this? So, May, with all of those steps that you were just detailing there, how should HR be viewing those steps? Is it about making a mindset shift and then sort of tweaking around the edges? Is it about wholesale change and upending everything we've known? Is it somewhere in the middle?
Look, the answer is probably a bit of both and somewhere in the middle. I would say first and foremost, the science and research shows people change not because their hearts and minds change, but because the systems they're in kind of nudge that change. And so from a behavioral economics and science perspective, you want to have systems that are espousing the things that you're promoting. Now, it doesn't have to be that you do everything all at once. As an HR leader, you might say, the top 3 priorities we have is we want our teams to be more innovative, or maybe we want our teams to be more inclusive, or maybe we want them to push boundaries. And whatever it is, what are the 2 or 3 behavioral tweaks that you want to see, and how can you create structures that allow for this? The second thing, though, is simultaneous to systems and process changes, you want to be changing mindsets. Mindsets is a big part of the equation, and what this necessitates is, I think, space for reflection, processing, and learning as an organization. Not just for our juniors and middle managers, but for leadership as a whole. Because if you're running from meeting to meeting, you're actually not being able to evaluate how am I reacting in this situation in a way that, is hurting everyone? Or what is my default when I'm, as a leader, faced with uncertainty? Where do I go to? Do I avoid it? Do I become controlling? Do I become protective? And that inner awareness of our automatic reactions as leaders, that mindset shift is something that we need to be working on. So simultaneously to process improvements, I would say having programs throughout our organization that allow people to see the interrelationship between their mindset and then the skills and the impact that has.
May, looking ahead to the future, what's your level of optimism that leaders and their HR teams will be able to move forward in the right ways here and navigate not only some of those macro shifts that we're seeing, but also some of the micro trends within their own workplaces?
I think I am optimistic. I wouldn't be doing this work. And at the same time, like with any tectonic shifts, I think we're living in a really interesting time right now. We're going to look back to this moment and see that a lot was shifting, and the pace and scale of change is exponential. Leaders and HR teams that are able to navigate that change by recognizing that they don't have all the answers is going to be really important. So one of the big things from a mindset perspective, I think, is normalizing experimentation. In a world that's constantly changing, we have hypotheses around what might work. The best organizations are learning organizations, ones that say, we're going to try X and let's see what happens. Let's measure it. And we might shift, but we're not changing with the course of the wind. We're quickly adapting, at a macro level. Being able to make that kind of messaging to your organization or to the world is really healthy. I think at a micro level, recognizing that as things are changing rapidly, the humans inside our workplaces are also going through huge changes. And so there's a lot of collateral damage and loss that comes from not only AI, which is one that we talk a lot about these days, but from other changes with the social contract of what work has meant. And a lot of this movement to say working for yourself or working across multiple revenue streams, this is having a huge shift on people's sense of identity and the role that work has played for them. So I think as effective leaders, I'm optimistic because I think if we can recognize that we don't know it all, to be brave to say, I don't have all the answers, but I'm willing to try, and then to connect at a human level and be compassionate for also the losses. I heard a famous quote recently that good leadership and adaptability and moving your people through change is not just about getting them excited for change, but moving them through loss at a pace that they can handle. And so it's about recognizing the loss that's going to happen and actually having the language and tools to move our people through that.
And May, just finally, in reflecting on shifting leadership expectations and what it all means for the future of work, why is this so exciting from your perspective and what excites you about your own work in this space?
I think it's so exciting. One, work is such a big part of our lives. Whether it's the amount of hours we spend on it, it's a form of human creativity, human flourishing. And I think we are at a precipice of rethinking the role of work in our lives and in our society. So that in and of itself, I think is really, really exciting. I think we're at a moment where, because of all the opportunities available to us as workers, as humans, to go off and disrupt conventional models of work, there's so much more human agency. There's human freedom to create, to be explorative, to experiment, to work with a whole range of different stakeholders, to develop mastery in new ways. And that is what this makes this so exciting for me. And ultimately it comes back to the word leadership itself. For me, leadership it's not a noun. It's not a position of authority. It's a verb. It's something you do. It's something you practice. And therefore, we all are leading our lives. If we can learn to lead our lives by thinking about what drives us, how we can best contribute to an ever-advancing society, then ultimately we have a lot more agency in terms of what work means to us.
May Samali, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Jerome.
And thank you to the listener for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a rating and review on whatever platform you use to listen to podcasts, as it'll help other HR leaders discover and enjoy this show. And if you've got ideas for other episodes we can run, please get in touch at editor@hrleader.com.au. You can also find us on social media. See you again next time.